Today, let's talk about thought, mid-19th century thought. That is, after the failures of the revolutions of 1848, and what begins after those revolutions have failed, is what some people call the age of realism. People much more realistic about their prospects, much more realistic about their politics, and so on and so forth. And you see it also in literature, you see it in art. Really, we're talking about the age of realism, when people begin to grapple with problems, real problems, but they try to do it now in more realistic ways, perhaps. But in any case, in the age of realism, take a look at literature first. The age of realism, we're talking about novels, for example, which deal with the realities of life, the class struggles of life, the new industrial conditions that were worsening life for many people. The novels of Dickens that many people are familiar with. Charles Dickens certainly talks about misery, poverty, the new urban conditions that are not so pleasant for so many people. And you have other things as well, other novels as well. Gustave Flaubert, Madame Bovary, who talks about the woman who has an affair, bored with her life, and he gets into really the psychological insights of what is going on in her head as she confronts the new life conditions that surround her. You have novels, Tolstoy, the great historical novels, Tolstoy writing about the aristocracy, its relations with the peasantry. He's writing about war, the great novel War and Peace, which took him something like a half-decade or more to write in the 1860s. And this is really a novel about real-world struggles. It's a novel about historical transitions. It's a novel about class relationships. It's a novel about objective relations that are social and economic and historical. You have Dostoevsky, one of the greatest writers ever, who's a master psychologist and a master at getting inside the heads of people who are suffering greatly, suffering from their own poverty, suffering from their own isolation, and their alienation, their loss of identity, their struggles with class struggles, all sorts of things that come to Dostoevsky, and Crime and Punishment, Brothers Karamazov, great novels that everybody should treasure and should read. Dostoevsky, as much as any writer ever, has tried to come to terms, tried to understand the modern conditions, the modern predicament. And Dostoevsky is also a precursor of existentialism, the attempt to find meaning in life when life itself seems to be absurd, when God is questioned. Dostoevsky comes to Christianity later, but he doesn't start there at all, so he has a constant sort of grappling with faith and what to do with issues of Christianity. A number of other thinkers outside of novelists, let's just take a look at them. For example, let's take a look at Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, who's already conducting experiments in the 1830s, will be doing his writings later, 40s and 50s. Charles Darwin's grandfather, actually, Erasmus Darwin, had discovered fossils, had studied them, was aware that there was something like evolution, was aware that life had been on the planet for a much longer time than had been suggested in Scripture, and therefore, as science continues, and continues with Darwin in particular, the maps of the past, the maps of life, how long life had been here, how long the Earth had been here, these all come into question, and they all become subjects of study. And it will be, of course, Darwin's Origins of Species and the Ascent of Man that will really come to terms and will try to define evolution. And of course, Darwin, who studies fossils, also comes to the realization that, in fact, life has been here for a very long time, but it also evolves, beginning with single-cell life to much more complicated, much more complex life, until, of course, the appearance and evolution of humanoids, of human beings. And this argument, this discovery, of course, is going to come directly into conflict with Christianity, because Darwin's timetables and Darwin's conclusions come also into conflict with Scripture, which suggests that life was born and that life was created once and for all by God, perhaps some 5,000–6,000 years ago. Darwin is talking about life that goes back maybe millions of years and evolves up until the present. What does Darwin say? Darwin says basically that species will survive depending on their ability to adapt. Their ability to adapt, meaning if they can employ colors which conceal their existence so that predators won't see them, if they will evolve and develop, let's say, claws and teeth, if they are agile, if they have speed. In other words, the species that is most able, or members of a species most able to make adaptations, will be those who will not only survive, but will also bring their characteristics. Their characteristics will actually expand. Their characteristics will become the dominant ones within a group or within a species, and of course they will pass on their characteristics to the next generation. What does all that mean? It means essentially that the ability to survive will depend on the ability to adapt. Those who adapt the best, again, they will pass this on to the next generation, which will be able to adapt even better. It's in this way, the struggle for existence, that adaptation occurs, and therefore the stronger ones will simply perpetuate their species, and the weaker ones will simply die out. That's how evolution occurs, and that's natural selection. That's the term that Darwin would use, and of course it sets religion. Religion needs to make a response, and there will be many responses, but of course Darwinism and the whole notion of natural selection will have a long history of contestation and conflict. But in any case, here was the advance of science, and science is now suggesting that mankind was not set here upon earth by God at a certain given time, but that in fact it had evolved. Then you have other theorists. Let me talk about Karl Marx. Karl Marx also, who writes the famous Communist Manifesto, which he actually rewrites after Engels writes the first edition of it, 1847, 1848. It precedes a series of revolutions in 1848, and all those revolutions ultimately fail. After that, Marx becomes, let us say, more of a Marxist. That is to say, his ideas evolve, his ideas develop. What is his principal idea? The idea that every age is motivated, that history itself develops according to class struggle. Each age has its own class struggle. If you go back to the Roman period, you're talking about plebeian versus patrician. In the medieval period, it might be the master versus the tradesman. And in the modern world, with the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, it's the bourgeoisie, the factory owners, etc., and the proletariat, or the working class. But at all times, it's class struggle. In the age of capitalism, according to Marx, and this is Marx's theory of history, in the age of capitalism, class struggle emerges because of the direct confrontation between the owners of capital, the owners of factories, the owners of the new means of production, and the workers who do not own them, who are now deprived of the means of production, and therefore have nothing to sell except their own labor. It is that process by which their labor is paid, by which their labor is employed, that leads to their direct exploitation. In a word, the worker is exploited, the worker gives more in value to the employer than he is paid as a wage, and that difference is profit. And for Marx, of course, that's going to drive class struggle all the way to the point of revolution. Well, the revolution just failed. Marx thinks, however, that it's possible as the working class grows and as suffrage expands, that the working class might in fact come into power through the vote. I actually believe that. And in any case, Marx, for the next 3 decades or so after the failed revolutions of 1848, will study how capital works and comes to the conclusion that the way it works inevitably that capitalism will simply produce its own destruction. That's the class struggle. And what comes next, of course, Marx never defines definitively, but he believes that what comes next is once the revolution or once the democracy succeeds, that there'll be no more need for an exploiting class, because the working class, which produces everything, will be able to be productive enough. And as long as nobody is skimming off the top, nobody is skimming the profit, then the working class will be able to produce what it needs, satisfy its needs. The age of scarcity is over. Exploitation is not necessary anymore. That's, in a nutshell, how Marx sees the end of capitalism. That's how he understands the economics of the era. Marx spent many, many decades sitting in the British Museum studying all sorts of government reports, government documents, and tried to make really kind of the study of history into a kind of a scientific study. So, economic history. Economics, to a large extent, determines where history is going. Economics, to a large extent, determines who the victors are going to be, and determines, actually in this case, what the next era is going to be after that. Along with Marx and Marxism, there's another school of thought that develops called anarchism. We're all familiar with that. Many of us think, well, we're now in the age of flamethrowers, and that's not what anarchists were all about. A number of anarchists, of course, were or did preach violence, but most of them did not. And actually, Leo Tolstoy, the novelist I mentioned earlier, the author of War and Peace, was himself an anarchist. And what that meant was that Tolstoy believed that the state was nothing more than an instrument of oppression, that the church, and of course he's referring to the Orthodox Church in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church, the church was nothing but the handmaiden of the state, which quite often it was. And therefore, Tolstoy believes that what will really bring about peace and a new sort of golden era will be to simply dissolve the state or to bypass the state and organize religion. Tolstoy, by the way, was actually a Christian himself, but he's a believer in Jesus, not the organized church, not organized Christianity. He believes, amongst other things, capitalism is bad, that it's best to bypass capitalism. That can be done by workers simply producing what they need for life, and perhaps also exchanging what they produce with each other directly, and bypassing the market, bypassing the circuits of capital, in other words. And that's a fairly common thing that you find amongst anarchists. The whole idea is to bypass the market, short-circuit the capital market, short-circuit capitalist exchanges, right? Don't work for the capitalist boss, work for yourself. That was the whole idea, sort of like cooperative organization of the economy. That was the whole idea of anarchism. Tolstoy, who was was a nobleman himself and owned a great estate, actually ends up giving a lot of his land back to the peasants who had been serfs, who are now peasants. They're not necessarily grateful because they thought, well, it was their land to begin with anyway. There's other anarchists who are important. P.J. Proudhon, he also believes that property, he said, his famous phrase, property is theft. And the best way to deal with that is simply to stop end private property. In other words, put workshops back into the hands of the people who are the actual producers. He also wants to get rid of the market. He believes that it's the middlemen or the direct exploiters who own the means of production who are causing all the trouble. So anarchism really is simply a way of bypassing or getting rid of capitalism and putting people who are actually doing the work in charge of the economy. There's other important thinkers as well. John Stuart Mill, very important. I'll just mention him, known as a utilitarian. What does he believe? The whole purpose of economy and the whole purpose of society and the whole purpose of the state is to make people happy. That is to say that institutions should have utility, usefulness. If they don't make people happy, then they're wrong. What doesn't make people happy? Well, capitalism. He was a democratic socialist. He believed very much in liberalism. That was just the beginning. He really believes that people need policies that would protect them. And in a lot of ways, he was the very first, or one of the very first democratic socialists. Some might even call him a social democrat. That is, where institutions should be put into place that would protect people, whether it's, pensions, aid to families, significant tax reform, basically that health care, for example, that would be available for everybody. That's the kind of thing that John Stuart Mill favored. And with that, we conclude the age of realism, the new age of realism.